Welcome to Getting to Know You, residents and staff at Stonebridge. And I'm hiding behind a stack of books that are all about presidents.
Yeah.
And they are from the library, so that after you talk with David Mulford today on this Zoom session of Getting to Know You, and you want to read about somebody, you can go to the library. And so that's a little introduction to about what we're going to talk about today and with David Mulford. So I'm going to move this stack of books with Trump on the top and I think Kennedy on the bottom, and I'm about to donate one on George Herbert Walker Bush. And then I even have one here from the library benefit called The Team of Five, and it's about the 5 most recent presidents and how they got along together. So I hope you're inspired by that. I'm going to be inspired by my conversation with David Mulford. As you know, February has a lot of stuff going on in it, and Valentine's Day, President's Day, and Black History Month. Now, I thought the View from the Bridge newsletter was just terrific with all the lovely stories about people getting together and getting married and all of that. So we're not going to talk about Valentine's Day, but we are going to talk about President's Day. And I'm so glad that we have David Mulford to do that. David, I don't think you know how many times you've already given talks at Stonebridge about presidents, do you?
Don't know the exact number, although I think I do have it jotted down somewhere.
Okay, well, you were very I shouldn't say it this way, that you were very popular. When we could do Saturday night programs, you were a regular and you
enjoyed it
for president every time. But I thought today that we'd play a little getting to know you as a person, and then I had asked you to think about some presidents that we should think about in Black History Month. So let's start first with how you got interested in presidents and sort of became an amateur expert?
Well, I certainly am an amateur, and it's hard when I think back to recall exactly when I first became interested, although I do remember, believe it or not, in 1936, which was coming up on 85 years ago, putting a poster for Landon and Knox, who were running against Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, in the window of our sun porch. So at the age of about 5, I must have been interested in presidents.
Okay.
My parents gave me a small book about the US presidents with a picture on the left side and some information on the right side. And I went through that book and I wore it out. The cover literally fell off. So my mother went out and bought me another copy of the same book. And I did the same thing. I read that through and through. I memorized all the presidents in sequence from George Washington to Franklin Roosevelt, which I can recite today, although after Roosevelt, I have to stop and think because I didn't learn it at that early age.
Yeah.
So this continued on through school and through college. I majored in history, was always fascinated with history. And it sort of was in the back of my mind all during my professional career, reading books on the presidents. And just before, a couple of months before I retired from a church in Florida in 1994, one of the adult supper clubs in the church I served needed a speaker. And I said, well, I'll talk about the presidents. And so I gave a talk entitled Getting to Know the Presidents. One of the men there, getting to know, just sort of an overview. And one of the men there said, oh, that was wonderful. I want you to come and speak at our Rotary District Convention in a couple of weeks. And I did that. And he said, now I have a brother who lives in the town that you and Nancy are moving to in North Carolina. I'm going to tell him about you. So, and about 2 weeks after we moved to Western North Carolina, I got an invitation to speak to the Rotary Club in that town. And that opened a Pandora's box of invitations and opportunities to speak on the president. So for the 12 years we lived there, I gave talks to retirement communities, civic organizations, luncheon clubs, dinner clubs. I taught in elder hostels, adult education programs. I do a 6-week series every Wednesday morning. So it just grew. And so during that period of retirement, I just reveled in it. But I always told people I'm an amateur, and that's
Right.
not an apology. It's
Yeah.
a statement.
Right.
Don't ask me the intricate fact. Don't ask me what was William McKinley's policy on the tariff. I wouldn't be able to tell you, but
Right.
I enjoy getting to know the presidents as human beings, what made them tick. And so I've enjoyed doing it here in Princeton as well.
Well, we certainly have enjoyed it, and I know that you also are sort of keeping up with the presidents. I guess when you first started, you could use the same talk for a while since you were doing it in the same place. So.
I did, and it's amazing. I have a file cabinet full of talks that I have given over these past 25 or so years. I've given some talks several times. I have a few talks I think I've never given, but I've had fun preparing them anyway. But my interest has grown, and I've expanded the topics that I cover in my talks.
Don't you find that there are many more books about presidents that are meant for amateurs or people who just simply want to get to know them than there used to be? There would be like one authorized biography or something, and but it seems like a lot of people want to weigh in on what they think of presidents.
Yes, there are many, many books. Every Christmas and my birthday, I always give my family a list of presidential books I want, because then I'll know I'll receive gifts that I really want to have. And so I get them, and I'm reading them all the time. And you're right, Ingrid, there are so many books on the presidents now. I have a stack here in our den of books, some of which I have read and some of which I have am looking forward to reading. So there are a great many books. There are some books that look at presidents in sort of a collective way. In other words, you talked about some of our recent presidents, some of our accidental presidents, vice presidents who took over when the president died. Books on presidential retirement years, what they did in their retirement. So there are lots and lots of books out there.
So what are you reading right now?
Well, I have a whole stack of books I got at Christmas. Right now, I have been reading Obama's A Promised Land. I read Michelle Obama's book several months ago, and I've just started this book, and it is well written. It is excellent. I have read a number of books. There is one called The President versus the Press, which talks about the relationship that presidents had with the press, sometimes adversarial, sometimes very complicated. So these are some of the books that I am reading right now.
There's a new book out on Jimmy Carter. That sounds interesting.
It is, and I have it right here next to my desk. It's called His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. I have read quite a bit about Jimmy Carter. In fact, he is one of my favorites in terms of finding out about him and sort of what makes him tick, the kind of person that he has been and is. So this is a new book. I haven't started yet, but I'm very anxious to read it. And of course, he's written a lot of books himself, memoirs and reflections and so forth. And I have read many of those.
Yeah, I guess you could put the books in categories, those that are autobiographies or books the presidents write because they want to talk about something. And authorized biographies that either the presidents, while they were still living, said somebody could write about them or had left instructions that it would be okay. And then all the commentary on the presidents. So.
Because autobiographies are one thing and biographies are another, because in an autobiography, you of course present yourself as you see yourself and in your best light. Some of the official presidential memoirs that they have written are not terribly interesting. Sometimes they go a lot into the detail of policies and so forth. But there are some wonderful, wonderful classic biographies of presidents. I think of David McCulloch and his biography of Truman, which is excellent. Of course, he did one on John Adams too. So there's no shortage of books either by the presidents or about them.
This maybe I'll make the transition to Black History Month. I heard an interview with the person who, I think it's Jay Tapper, who wrote this book about Jimmy Carter. And someone asked, how did Jimmy Carter govern as a governor? in Georgia and deal with the justice issues in what was then the Black Power movement. And it was very interesting that he had to explain how Jimmy Carter actually lived in the white society and had a business, and that in his own town, it was really very dangerous for whites to exhibit publicly any kind of support for the Black justice movement, and that he had been, he could have been visited by the same kind of violence that another business had been visited by, and the town was frightened. Is that something that you've read about? I mean,
I have. It's interesting that Jimmy Carter, when he was growing up at this little farm outside of Plains, Georgia, his playmates were mostly all Blacks.
mm-hmm.
They were the children of workers who worked on his father's farm. So he had this early contact. His friends were Black children. So he grew up in that. But then in his town, he did run into some strong opposition because of his views on race and acceptance of others. And this was a challenge, and I give him a lot of credit for standing up for that. Of course, he was influenced largely by his mother, Miss Lillian.
Right.
Very much for integration, not by his father, who was very much a segregationist.
So that was a terrible thing for him to have to live with, and then think about how you are a leader and not just a politician. Are there other presidents that you think of that that really dealt with this, the issue of changing the legal system and standing up for the rights of Black people that we don't often hear about? I mean, Lincoln obviously comes to mind. I think Grant probably was also an unknown person in terms of his commitment in that era, in the time that he lived, being in the Civil War. But what can I ask you about that one, or about him? Yeah.
Just let me reflect a little bit here on the whole picture, really, of presidents and race. It's very interesting. As I look back, I have never given a talk about presidents and race. If I had not sort of faded away in my presidential talks a few years ago, I bet I would, because I think it's a very, very important issue. And I think it's interesting to sort of look very, very quickly at the whole history of it, really, because your early presidents, particularly those from the South, although there was certainly slavery in the North, as we know very well, but they were slaveholders, and yet you had all men are created equal, but some were more equal than others. That was it. That was the philosophy. So you had that in our early presidents. You had the idea of all people being created, and yet they weren't. And so you go through, you see Jackson and his Trail of Tears, the Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma. And then, of course, you do come to Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. Although Lincoln, like so many people, in some of his own personal views about Blacks and attitude towards Blacks, is not as ideal as we would like. But then again, we have to realize this was the 1850s and the 1860s. You spoke about Grant. You spoke about, or didn't you mention him, and of course Reconstruction after the Civil War. And that led up to the election of 1876, which has been referred to in our recent election as another very turbulent election, where Hayes, the Republican, was running against Tilden, the Democrat, very close, and Hayes was elected by one electoral vote. And it was brought about by some maneuvering of the electors in the South, in the deep South. And he became president. And as a result of that bargain, the military was withdrawn from the South, and Reconstruction, as Grant had supported it, as Lincoln had opposed it, was gone. And you went back, before that, during that period, you had Black governors, you had Black senators, you had Black congressmen. Then it was gone, and it went back to Jim Crow and eventually to the Ku Klux Klan. So that was a sort of a setback for the whole nations. Then you come forward, you come up to people like Teddy Roosevelt, who entertained Booker T. Washington for dinner in the White House, and he was vilified for that. The very idea that a Black person would be entertained socially in the White House. He did that, and yet he himself had views, Teddy Roosevelt, representative of that time, that were not particularly favorable. Woodrow Wilson, we certainly know him here in Princeton.
Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson was a product of the South, born a young man, a boy during the Civil War, and he had very definite views about that, which we are realizing now. And it's interesting that he eliminated so many Blacks, African Americans, from being able to serve in government posts. And it's interesting that his successor, Warren Harding, who is no prize and is usually considered one of the worst presidents, the Teapot Dome scandal, and plus his own personal life, and he restored Negroes, Blacks rather, to positions in the government. Then, of course, you had Franklin Roosevelt. You had Eleanor Roosevelt, who is much more of an advocate than the Blacks, the African Americans.
And he had to deal with the Dixiecrats in the South.
Dixiecrats in the South.
Democrats.
You had that. You had Truman, who desegregated the military. You have Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Movement, which really, the Solid South had been Democratic up until then. But after that, it was solid, but it was solid Republican, although we're seeing cracks in it today. So, you see that whole picture of how presidents dealt with the issue of race and the place of African Americans in our government and in our society.
It's interesting too, if you think about where does leadership come from? Well, leadership can be one thing for some people and another thing for other people. It's how you choose to be a leader that I guess gets you.
And it's interesting to see how people do change. And I think as we look at some of our presidents, you see some have not, but others have advanced in their views and turned their back on some of their earlier held views. And that's a good thing.
I guess you probably haven't, did you get to the part in Obama's book where he talks about his changes in same-sex marriage and how you think about that? I mean, that's another indication of
on to that part.
Justice and so on.
But it's interesting, of course, as we all know, having a Black president and now having a Black and South Asian vice president, a woman as vice president. So there have been many things that we see now that wouldn't have been thought possible some years ago, although we have a long way to go.
Right. And then I guess we could say every voter plays a role in what a president can do. And so you can't just look to the leader or the president. It sort of looks at us.
Yes.
And
voters' ideas and how those change over the years have their impact.
Well, this has been fascinating. If I have this stack of books here, I don't know who will want to read them, but if you had to recommend, you've talked about a number of books, if you had to recommend a book or two that was sort of surprising that you might not think of reading, would you like to end this conversation with a challenge to people here at Stonebridge to visit their library or Amazon and try something?
There are so many books. I've mentioned some. One that I have to look around and see it here. There's an interesting new book, and it's called Author in Chief. And it's a new book about presidents as authors.
Oh, okay.
And I guess we do realize that, but some of the presidents were authors in a sense which went beyond simply writing their memoirs or autobiographies. So that is a good one. Another book that I haven't read yet, but is on my list here, and it isn't directly about a president, but I'm sure it will tell you a lot about the presidency. And that is the new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, about James Baker, who was close to George H.W. Bush and exerted an enormous influence in that particular period. And I mentioned, of course, we talked.
He's a very influential Princetonian, faithful alum, very supportive of the school, but he also was a chief advisor to George Shultz, also a Princetonian.
I see, yeah.
And together, I think they were influential in what happened in our government and in international relations, but also in economic policy, since they were both interested in that. So they're practically hometown boys.
Connection. And I wouldn't, just to conclude it here, I wouldn't rule out some of the older books that are really, as I mentioned before, some of the classic biographies. And I'd like to conclude my comments here with just a little picture, word picture from David McCulloch's book on Truman that sort of blows my mind and reminds me why I'm so interested in the presidents. In that book, there is a photograph of Harry Truman back around 1916. He was in his early 30s. He was still single. He was a farmer in Lamar, Missouri, outside of Kansas City. And this picture has him sitting behind a plow being pulled by two horses. He has an old slouch hat on his head, old clothes. And you look at him there and you think, well, that young man, he doesn't have much to look forward to. At that time, Truman had said to Bess, who he was interested in, but they hadn't married yet. He said, I used to think I might make something of myself, but I'm not so sure now. That picture. Then jump ahead to 1945, 46, 47, when Winston Churchill said of Harry Truman, he did more than any other single individual to save Western civilization with the Marshall Plan and so on. Now, that's the thing that fascinates me from a very inauspicious beginning.
Right.
Never know. And that's why I'm interested, because these men and women eventually too, it's fascinating how some came from such a humble beginning and made such a profound impression on our country and world.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all your observations and for reminding us that every person has potential and it's up to us to have an open mind.
Totally right. That's so true.
Truman. So thank you so much, David, for telling us how much you enjoy getting to know our presidents and thinking about their lives. And I hope that inspires some other people to delve into the things that have engaged you so much over the years. So we really appreciate this.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. And this is Getting to Know You about the presidents and, of course, our friend and neighbor, David Mulford, here at Stonebridge. See you next time. We're still talking about February, so wait and see what else we have in mind. Bye for now. I'm Ingrid Reed. Jock McFarland has been running the Zoom machine for us. So thank you, Jock. And we'll be back again. Bye.